I had just finished rebuilding the bridge behind my property, the one that crossed a narrow stream and gave me direct access to the lake. It wasn't anything fancy, just some pressure-treated wood, handrails, and a platform I could fish from in the evenings. For me, it wasn't just about convenience. That bridge was a piece of peace I'd been missing since retiring from the Forest Service. It was my project, my retreat, and the one part of my property where I could feel truly disconnected from the HOA nonsense that seemed to follow me since moving into Copper Hills Estates. That peace shattered the moment Crystal Whitlow, our HOA president, showed up with a clipboard and that condescending smile she reserved for moments she thought she was educating someone. "Garrett, we've had some complaints about unauthorized construction. Did you pull a permit for that bridge?" she asked, peering at the structure like it was some kind of code violation ticking time bomb. I explained that the bridge was entirely on my property, spanning a stream that was part of the easement detailed in my deed. I'd checked the zoning laws myself. There was no legal requirement for a permit on personal, non-commercial footbridges in this part of the county. Crystal didn't like that answer. "It's about safety," she said. "What if a child wandered onto it and got hurt?" I responded flatly, "Then their parents shouldn't let them play on private property." That set off the chain reaction. Within a week, I got 3 letters from the HOA, all citing vague community safety concerns and demanding I remove the structure. I ignored them. That's when Crystal escalated. She called an emergency HOA meeting. I didn't attend. But Mike Coleman, one of the board members who actually had a spine, filled me in. Crystal had whipped the room into a frenzy, claiming the bridge was an unlicensed hazard and that I was endangering community standards. She even floated the idea of using HOA funds to dismantle it. That's when I knew this wasn't just about a bridge. It was about control. Crystal needed everyone to know she ran Copper Hills Estates, and anyone who pushed back would pay for it. What she didn't know was that I'd spent 22 years dealing with bureaucrats, wildfires, and mountain rescues. I didn't back down from bullies, even ones in designer heels. The next day, I posted a small wooden sign that read, "Maintenance in progress. Please do not disturb." It was a polite way of saying construction zone, but it had the added benefit of making people wonder what exactly was being maintained and why. Within hours, I started getting curious looks from neighbors walking their dogs, and I could see curtains twitching in windows as people tried to figure out what was happening at the lake access point. They'd taken for granted for years. The psychological effect was immediate and amusing. Nancy Fisher stopped by that evening, ostensibly to borrow a cup of sugar, but really to fish for information about my sign. "Everything okay with your bridge, Garrett? That sign has people talking." I kept my expression neutral and just said, "Oh, just some routine maintenance. It's nothing to worry about." But I could see the wheels turning in her head. The dawning realization that something bigger might be at stake. Lived here for 5 years and had never thought twice about walking down to the lake whenever she wanted. The idea that access might not be guaranteed had never crossed her mind. That's when old Hank Morrison stopped by, the retired police officer who'd lived in Copper Hills longer than anyone except the original developers. Hank had seen enough neighborhood disputes to recognize the signs of escalating conflict, and he'd been watching Crystal's campaign against my bridge with the experienced eye of someone who understood how small problems could become big ones. He took one look at my maintenance in progress sign and just chuckled, shaking his head. "That bridge is the soul of this place, son. The little lady doesn't know what fire she's playing with." Hank had a way of cutting through. Nonsense was simple wisdom, and his words carried the weight of someone who'd seen plenty of power-hungry people overreach and fall. Crystal, meanwhile, was escalating her own tactics. Through Mike Coleman's network of contractor friends, word filtered back to me that she'd been making calls to local construction companies, asking about emergency repair services and unsafe structure removal. She was shopping for someone, willing to tear down my bridge under the guise of public safety, probably planning to present it as a fait accompli at the next HOA meeting. The woman was nothing if not thorough in her scheming. But she was also digging herself deeper into a hole she didn't even know existed. Late that night, I sat at my kitchen table with the property surveys spread out in front of me, a cup of coffee growing cold as I traced boundary lines and easement descriptions with my finger. The original owner had been smarter than I'd given him credit for, negotiating exclusive lake access rights when the area was first developed. More importantly, every other potential access point to the lake had been declared off-limits for environmental protection reasons. The state had classified the surrounding wetlands as protected habitat, which meant my bridge wasn't just a convenience, it was the only legal way for anyone in Copper Hills Estates to reach the water. Sound of machinery rumbled like hunting beasts in the night. Through my kitchen window, I could see Crystal directing her survey team like a general commanding a military campaign. My peaceful Saturday had just been replaced by a new battlefront. The next morning brought my answer in the form of Nancy Fisher, knocking on my door at 6 a.m., still in her bathrobe and looking genuinely alarmed. "Garrett, you need to see this." Crystal hired some company to do emergency infrastructure assessment around the lake area. They've got equipment and everything. As I watched Crystal coordinate her little army of contractors from my kitchen window, I felt something shift inside me. This wasn't about community standards or property values anymore. This was about power, control, and one woman's desperate need to prove she could bend an entire neighborhood to her will. She'd moved beyond negotiation, beyond legal intimidation, and straight into the realm of direct action. Fine, if Crystal wanted to play hardball, she was about to learn that some games have consequences she'd never considered. The machinery noises were getting closer. I had a sinking feeling that my peaceful Saturday morning was about to become anything but peaceful. 5:30 in the morning is supposed to be peaceful in the mountains of Montana, especially on a Saturday when most sane people are still asleep. Instead, I woke up to the mechanical roar of a bulldozer that sounded like it was parked in my living room. I stumbled out of bed, threw on yesterday's clothes, and rushed outside to find my worst nightmare becoming reality. Crew of construction workers was systematically destroying my bridge, piece by carefully crafted piece, while Crystal Whitlow stood 20 feet away with her phone held high, recording every moment of my shock and devastation. The bulldozer operator was methodical in his destruction, starting with the support posts and working his way across the span I'd spent 8 months building by hand. Each piece of cedar that fell into the water represented hours of careful planning, measuring, cutting, and carving. Looking at every piece of wood falling into the lake, I couldn't help but remember the scenes from my old rescue work in the forests. How things you tend to every day can disappear in an instant. The decorative railings I'd shaped during quiet evenings, a platform where I'd watched dozens of sunsets, the small details that had made this bridge uniquely mine, all of it was being reduced to floating debris in a matter of minutes. "Stop," I yelled, running toward the machinery. "You can't do this. This is my property." But the operator either couldn't hear me over the engine noise or had been specifically instructed to ignore any protests. "Crystal." His voice cut through the morning air like a blade. "Emergency waterline maintenance, Mr. Langley, the city identified your structure as a potential hazard to underground utilities." She held up an official-looking work order, though from my distance I couldn't read the details. Sometimes these things happen on short notice. The way she said it, with that satisfied smile playing around her lips, made it crystal clear that nothing about this was accidental or emergency. This was calculated destruction, planned and executed with military precision while I slept. I remembered that first day I'd laid the initial plank under a light spring snow. My hands were cracked and bleeding from the cold, but my heart felt calm for the first time in years. Now all of that piece was being torn apart by someone else's need for control. I stood in the growing pile of wood debris, holding a piece of the nameplate I'd carved with my own hands, now split cleanly in half. 8 months of work destroyed. In 8 minutes, the physical pain was nothing compared to the emotional gut punch of watching something I'd created with love and patience get obliterated by someone else's petty power trip. My hands shook as I picked up splinters of cedar that still smelled like sawdust in mountain air, trying to process the reality that my sanctuary was gone. Looking at every piece of wood scattered in the water, I was reminded of the friends I'd lost during forest rescue operations, how the things we cherish can vanish without warning, leaving only memories and regret. Here's where Crystal made her first tactical error, though she didn't realize it at the time. While she was busy recording my emotional breakdown, her phone also picked up her voice as she directed the demolition crew. "Make sure you get the center section completely down first," she told the bulldozer operator. "We don't want it. Any chance of someone trying to repair it? That little piece of audio evidence would prove very useful later." But in the moment, I was too devastated to appreciate the gift she'd just handed me. All I could see was the destruction of something that had represented hope and healing in my life. Mike Coleman appeared at my shoulder like a guardian angel, his electrician's work truck still running in my driveway. "This is completely illegal. Garrett, there's no emergency waterline work scheduled in this area." He'd been monitoring the county utility schedules as part of his business. He knew damn well that Crystal's emergency maintenance story was pure fiction. "She's gone too far this time. This isn't about community standards anymore. It's about one woman's power trip." His words were comforting, but they couldn't undo the damage that was already done. The bridge that had connected me to peace was gone, and with it, any illusion that Crystal would stop at reasonable limits. As the demolition crew packed up their equipment and drove away, leaving behind nothing but scattered wood debris and churned up mud where my bridge used to be, Crystal approached me with fake sympathy dripping from her voice. "I'm sorry it had to come to this, Mr. Langley, but sometimes decisive action is necessary for the good of the community." She tucked her phone into her purse with the satisfied air of someone who just won a chess match. "Perhaps now you'll understand the importance of working within established guidelines." Then she turned and walked away, leaving me standing in the wreckage of my peace project. But here's the thing about destroying someone's bridge. Sometimes you don't realize you've just cut off your own escape route. As I stood there, among the floating pieces of cedar watching Crystal's perfectly styled figure disappear down the road, a memory from my Forest Service days suddenly surfaced. Those property surveys I'd been studying, the easement rights I'd discovered, environmental protections around Moonstone Lake. Crystal had just made the biggest mistake of her HOA presidency. She destroyed the only legal access point to the lake, effectively cutting off 47 families from the water they'd taken for granted. And since the easement belonged to my property, I was the only person who could authorize the use of it. The irony was so perfect it almost made up for the heartbreak of losing my bridge. Almost Crystal thought she'd won by destroying my connection to the lake. But what she'd actually done was hand me the keys to everyone else's connection. The morning after the bridge destruction, I sat at my kitchen table with property surveys, old Forest Service maps, and a cup of coffee that had long since gone cold. The pieces of the puzzle were finally clicking together in ways that Crystal clearly hadn't anticipated. My years maintaining federal trail systems taught me to read land use documents like other people read newspapers. And what I was seeing made me realize that Crystal had just committed the equivalent of burning down the only bridge out of town, the exclusive lake access. Easement attached to my property wasn't just a legal footnote, it was the key to everything. Crystal kept scrambling around like a chicken with its head cut off, thinking she could throw HOA money at the problem and fill in the hole she just dug for herself. All the other paths down to the lake were protected by environmental laws. No construction, no regular foot traffic allowed. Only my bridge had been the legal connection. Crystal thought she'd just won a victory, but she'd actually cut the rope that held the entire community together. I didn't yell, didn't seek loud revenge. I just put up a small sign and let people draw their own conclusions. Like my grandfather used to say, fools always make the most noise. Smart folks just stay quiet and wait for the right moment. I decided it was time to send the community a gentle reminder of what they had lost. That afternoon, I walked out to where my bridge used to stand and erected a large wooden sign that read "No Bridge." No lake access in bold black letters that could be seen from the main road. The message was simple, clear, and calculated to make people think about cause and effect within hours. Neighbors were stopping their morning walks to stare at the sign, and I could see the dawning realization in their faces as they processed what it might mean for their own lake activities. Psychological pressure was immediate and exactly what I'd hoped for. Nancy Fisher was the first to approach me directly, arriving at my door that evening with worry lines creasing her forehead. "Garrett, what exactly does that sign mean?" "My kids have been swimming in that lake every summer for 5 years. I kept my expression neutral and sympathetic. Well, Nancy, Crystal had my bridge destroyed because she said it was unauthorized. The thing is, that bridge was the only authorized way to get to the lake from our neighborhood. All the other paths cross protected wetland areas. I watched her face go pale as the implications sank in. So you're saying we can't use the lake anymore? I shrugged with the calm patience of someone who'd learned to let problems solve themselves. I'm saying the legal access is gone. I'm the only one who can authorize rebuilding it. Meanwhile, Crystal was continuing to dig herself deeper into the hole she'd created. Through Mike Coleman's network of local tradesmen, I learned that she'd hired an expensive landscaping company to begin improving the lake area, with new pathways and aesthetic enhancements. She was spending HOA money on beautification projects for an area that the community could no longer legally access. The irony was delicious. But I kept my amusement to myself and continued to let Crystal operate under the illusion that she'd won some kind of victory. Watching her throw good money after bad was like watching someone try to water a garden with a broken hose, all effort. No results. Crystal hired contractors to cut through protected environmental zones like the conservation. Laws were suggestions, not actual regulations. I didn't say anything, just stood there and took a few pictures. Sometimes you just need to provide the rope. They'll tie the knot themselves. Every day, she continued with her unauthorized improvements. She was creating more evidence that would come back to haunt her. Sometimes the best strategy is just giving your opponent enough rope to hang themselves with. By the end of the week, the psychological pressure was starting to show throughout the neighborhood. Parents were explaining to disappointed children why they couldn't go swimming anymore. Weekend fishing trips were canceled. The annual community barbecue that traditionally took place by the lake was quietly postponed. Nancy Fisher had started organizing informal meetings where neighbors shared their frustration about losing lake access, and Crystal's name was coming up more and more often in less than flattering contexts. The beautiful thing about truth is that it has a way of surfacing on its own. You don't have to force it. I spent those days preparing for the next phase of my counterattack, researching property law and consulting with a real estate attorney who specialized in easement disputes. The legal landscape was even more favorable than I'd initially realized. Not only did I have exclusive rights to authorize lake access, but Crystal's destruction of my bridge could be considered interference with a legal easement potentially, making her liable for damages and restoration costs. The attorney's exact words were music to my ears. You don't just have the right to deny access. You have the legal authority to demand compensation for the destroyed bridge and control any future access arrangements. The final piece of my strategy involved waiting for Crystal to overplay her hand, which I knew she would do, because her personality wouldn't allow her to accept anything less than total victory. Mike Coleman had mentioned that she was planning a special HOA meeting to present her lake area improvement project and request additional funding for the beautification work. That meeting would be the perfect venue to reveal the legal reality she'd been ignoring. Crystal thought she was planning a victory celebration, but she was actually setting up her own public humiliation as I sat on my back porch that Friday evening. Looking out at the lake I could no longer reach in the community that had been cut off from their recreational haven, I felt a mixture of sadness and anticipation. Sadness for the bridge I'd lost and the peaceful evenings I'd spent fishing from its platform. Anticipation for the moment when Crystal would finally understand the consequences of her action. Like my grandfather always said, a bridge doesn't just connect land, it connects people. When someone destroys that connection, they're the ones who end up stranded on the wrong side. The weekend was coming, and with it, the first real test of how long the community would tolerate being locked away from their lake. Monday's HOA meeting was going to be very interesting indeed. Monday evenings? HOA meeting had the feel of a corporate presentation crossed with a town hall showdown. Crystal had reserved the community center's main room and set up her laptop and projector. Like she was delivering a quarterly earnings report to shareholders, 12 board members and concerned. Residents filled the folding chairs, creating an audience that was equal parts curious and frustrated. Crystal stood at the front of the room, wearing her power suit and confident smile, completely unaware that she was about to experience the most public failure of her HOA presidency. Her presentation was a masterpiece of expensive delusion. Professional slides showcased rendered images of stone pathways, decorative benches, and landscaped gardens that would transform the Moonstone Lake area into something resembling a resort brochure. Phase 1 of our comprehensive lake area enhancement project, she announced with the authority of someone who'd never been wrong about anything, represents an investment of $180,000 in community beautification and property value improvement. The price tag drew gasps from the audience, but Crystal pressed on undeterred. The return on this investment will be measurable in both increased home values and enhanced quality of life for all residents. I sat in the back row with my own folder of documents, watching Crystal dig herself deeper with every enthusiastic slide. She detailed walking paths that crossed protected wetlands, viewing areas that required permits she hadn't obtained, and improvement projects that assumed community access to land that was no longer legally available. Mike Coleman caught my eye and raised his eyebrows, questioningly, but I just nodded toward the front of the room, where Crystal was describing amenities for a lake that her own actions had made inaccessible to the community. When Crystal finished her presentation and asked for questions, I stood up slowly and made my way to the front of the room. I have some information that might be relevant to this discussion. I opened my folder and spread out the property surveys, easement documents, and environmental protection maps on the table beside her laptop. When I unfolded those maps on the table, the entire room went dead silent. You could have heard a pin drop and it would have been loud enough to make Mike frown. These are the legal documents that govern lake access for our community. Crystal's confident expression flickered for just a moment, but she quickly recovered her composure. I'm not sure how property boundaries relate to our improvement project, Mr. Langley. That's when I dropped the legal bombshell that Crystal had somehow failed to research, despite her elaborate planning. According to the original 1987 development agreement, my property holds the exclusive easement for lake access from Copper Hills Estates. The bridge you had destroyed last week was the only legal pathway to Moonstone Lake for anyone in this community. The silence in the room was thick enough to cut with a knife as 12 faces turned from me to Crystal and Dee-End. Back again, Nancy Fisher was the first to speak, her voice barely above a whisper. Are you saying we can't use the lake anymore? Crystal tried to maintain her authority, but I could see panic starting to creep into her eyes. That's ridiculous. The lake belongs to everyone. It's a community resource. Pulled out the environmental protection documents and spread them on the table. The lake itself is public water, but every access point except my property crosses protected wetland areas. The state environmental agency was very specific about prohibiting any construction or regular foot traffic through those zones. Mike Coleman leaned forward in his chair, studying the maps with the focused attention of someone who understood property disputes. So you're saying Crystal just cut off our only legal way to get to the water? That's when a woman sitting in the back row spoke up, her voice carrying the weight of years and deep frustration. I've been taking my grandson fishing every week for 3 years. You didn't just destroy a bridge, you destroyed our family tradition. Words hit the room like a physical blow, and I could see several other residents nodding in agreement. The atmosphere shifted, like air pressure before a thunderstorm. As 12 residents who'd been listening to Crystal's expensive beautification plans suddenly realized they were discussing improvements to an area they could no longer legally access, Crystal made one last desperate attempt to maintain control of the narrative. This is clearly a misunderstanding. I'm sure we can work with the environmental agencies to establish proper access routes, but I was ready for that deflection too. I pulled out photographs of the landscaping work she'd authorized over the past week. These pictures show the unauthorized pathway construction your landscaping crew has been doing through protected wetland areas. Every day they've been working represents additional environmental violations that will need to be remediated before any new access can even be considered. The meeting devolved into heated discussions as residents realized the full scope of what Crystal had done. She'd destroyed their lake access, spent their HOA fees on improvements to an area they couldn't use, and potentially created environmental violations that could result in fines and legal action against the entire community. Mike Coleman stood up and addressed the room with the calm authority of someone who'd spent years solving complex problems. I think we need to have a serious discussion about leadership accountability, finding a path forward. That's when I delivered my ultimatum, spoken clearly enough for everyone to understand their options. I can authorize the reconstruction of lake access, but it will require 3 things. First, the HOA will pay for rebuilding my bridge exactly as it was before. Second, Crystal Whitlow will resign as HOA president and issue a public apology for her actions. Third, any future lake area decisions will go through proper legal channels with full community input. The room erupted in discussions as residents weighed their options, accept my terms and regain their lake access, or support Crystal and remain permanently locked away from the water they'd taken for granted. Crystal's face had gone from confident pink to pale white as the reality of her situation finally sank in. She'd gambled everything on a power play that had exploded in her face, leaving her community angry. Her authority shattered and her legal position completely untenable. As residents filed out of the meeting to discuss their options privately, I could see in Crystal's eyes the dawning realization that she just handed me complete control over the one thing that mattered most to every family in Copper Hills Estates. The morning after the HOA meeting brought a steady stream of visitors to my front door each, one representing another crack in Crystal's rapidly crumbling authority. Nancy Fisher arrived first, followed by 3 other families with children who'd been counting on summer swimming sessions. By 10 a.m., I had 8 neighbors gathered in my living room, all of them asking the same basic question: what would it take to get their lake access back? The answer was simple. But Crystal was making it complicated by refusing to accept responsibility for the mess she'd created. While these conversations were happening at my house, Crystal was apparently making phone calls to lawyers, environmental agencies, and anyone else who might help her find a way out of the corner she'd painted herself into.
Ow.
But every avenue she explored led back to the same legal reality. I owned the only authorized lake access. She'd destroyed it without permission. The community was stuck until we reached an agreement. Mike Coleman stopped by around noon with an update from his network of contractors and municipal contacts. She's tried calling the county, the state environmental office, and 3 different law firms. They all told her the same thing: you hold all the cards here. By Wednesday, the psychological pressure was showing throughout Copper Hills Estates. The community swimming pool had a waiting list for the first time in years, as families sought alternative water recreation. Weekend fishing trips were being canceled or relocated to public access points 20 miles away. The annual 4th of July lakeside barbecue that had been a neighborhood tradition for 8 years was quietly postponed indefinitely. Crystal's beautification project continued despite its pointlessness, creating more evidence of her poor judgment with every dollar spent on improvements to an inaccessible area. Thursday brought the breaking point in the form of a petition that Nancy Fisher had been quietly circulating. 11 of the 12 HOA board members had signed a document requesting Crystal's immediate resignation and authorizing negotiations with me for lake access restoration. The holdout was Crystal herself, who was apparently still hoping to find some legal loophole that would restore her authority and validate her destructive decision-making. But hope and reality were diverging rapidly in her world. That evening, Crystal finally swallowed her pride enough to knock on my door for a private conversation. Gone was the commanding presence and confident authority she'd displayed during our previous encounters. Instead, she looked like someone who'd spent sleepless nights coming to terms with the consequences of her actions. "Mr. Langley, I think there's been a misunderstanding about the bridge situation." I invited her to sit on my back porch, where we could look out at the lake she'd made inaccessible to her own community. The only misunderstanding, Crystal, was your assumption that you could destroy my property without consequences. Crystal tried several different approaches during our conversation, ranging from attempted negotiation to barely concealed threats to outright pleading. She offered to have the HOA pay for bridge reconstruction if I would publicly support her leadership. She suggested that my misinterpretation of the easement documents was creating unnecessary conflict. She even hinted that my obstinate behavior might result in legal action against me. But every argument she made came back to the same fundamental problem. She'd destroyed the community's lake access, and I was the only person who could restore it. The conversation took an interesting turn when I pulled out my phone and played back the audio. I'd extracted from her Demolition Day video, her own voice clear as a mountain stream, directing the bulldozer operator. Get the center section completely down first, and make sure there's no chance of someone trying to repair it. Crystal's face went through several color changes as she listened to evidence of her premeditated destruction of community infrastructure. That was taken out of context, she said weakly. But we both knew that context wasn't going to save her from the consequences of her recorded words. Friday morning brought the community meeting that would determine Crystal's fate and the future of lake access for Copper Hills Estates. This time the gathering was held at Nancy Fisher's house, with 15 residents crowded into her living room to hear my final offer. The terms were straightforward and non-negotiable. Complete bridge reconstruction funded by HOA reserves, Crystal's resignation and public apology, establishment of a community oversight committee for any future lake area decisions. The alternative? Permanent loss of lake access and potential legal liability for environmental violations caused by Crystal's unauthorized landscaping project. The vote was as swift as it was decisive. 14 residents supported accepting my terms, with only Crystal herself opposed to the resolution. Mike Coleman was elected as interim HOA president, and within an hour of the vote, Crystal was drafting her resignation letter. The document was a masterpiece of political face-saving that acknowledged differences in community vision without admitting to any specific wrongdoing. But the important thing was that it was signed and effective immediately. Bridge reconstruction began the following Monday with a crew of local contractors who understood both the original design and the legal requirements for easement infrastructure. I supervised the work personally, ensuring that every detail matched my original construction, while incorporating improvements suggested by the Community Oversight Committee. Nancy Fisher were among the first to test the new bridge. When it was completed 6 weeks later, their laughter echoing across Moonstone Lake, like a celebration of restored community access. The final chapter of the Crystal Whitlow saga played out over the following months as she gradually withdrew from neighborhood, social activities, and community involvement. She still lived in Copper Hills Estates, but her days of commanding authority and imposing her vision on unwilling neighbors were permanently over. The experience had taught her, and everyone else, a valuable lesson about the difference between leadership and domination, between community improvement and personal power trips. As I sit here on my rebuilt bridge this evening watching the sunset paint Moonstone Lake in shades of gold and orange, I can hear the gentle creaking of wood under my feet and the sound of children's laughter carried on the mountain breeze. What Crystal tried to destroy was peace itself. But peace has a way of returning when people stand together. I'm reminded of something my grandfather used to tell me. A bridge doesn't just connect land, it connects people. And when someone tries to break that connection, they're the ones who end up stranded on the wrong side. Crystal thought that destroying my bridge would force me to submit to her authority. But she never considered that some actions have consequences that reach far beyond their intended targets. She wanted to control one man's access to the lake, and ended up losing her own community's access instead. Sometimes the most powerful response to destruction isn't revenge. It's rebuilding what was lost, stronger than before. The new bridge carries more than just people to the water. It carries the lesson that when communities stand together against those who would divide them, they become unbreakable. Crystal learned that authority built on fear and control crumbles quickly, while leadership built on trust and respect endures.